Hello, everyone. On this episode, I'm going to explain, I'm going to give you an analogy of why I believe, that perfectly proves why atheism is wrong. So the analogy goes by this, a caveman wakes up at night, right? And sees that there's no sun in front of him. A logical person, when he wakes up at night, midnight, and sees that there's no sun in front of him, what do you think the logical person would say? Where's the sun? You know, did the sun go somewhere? Did the sun move anywhere? Right? We need to find where the sun went. Where did the sun disappear to? Did someone steal the sun? Did something happen to the sun? Did someone destroy the sun? Let's look for evidence, right? But instead of that mindset, an atheist has the equal opposite mindset. An atheist, the mindset of an atheist is that God doesn't exist, right? So with that mindset that God doesn't exist, they believe that God doesn't exist. The caveman who woke up in the middle of the night, don't you think it's wrong to automatically believe that the sun doesn't exist? The caveman with the mindset of an atheist will automatically believe that, because they don't see the sun anywhere, right? It automatically means the sun doesn't exist. Don't you think there's something logically wrong with someone who's incapable of reasoning that there are many reasons why you don't see the sun in front of you, and the most illogical choice to make, the most illogical belief is to believe that the sun doesn't exist just because you don't see it at night, that the sun has somehow disappeared and ceases to exist. That's why you don't see the sun at night. Don't you think that's the most illogical choice out of all the choices to make? Instead of searching for answers, right? An atheist, instead of looking for answers where the sun went, instead just decided to just believe that the sun doesn't exist. They just decided to believe that God doesn't exist. And then when you tell them, why do you believe that God doesn't exist without evidence? You say there's no need for evidence. It is the theists that need to prove that God exists. So when you ask a caveman, why do you believe that the sun doesn't exist just because you don't see it out there? They'll tell you, there's no need for evidence. You need to prove to me that the sun exists. Otherwise, I will automatically believe that the sun doesn't exist. Don't you think it's illogical by default to automatically believe something without proof? And that's what atheists are doing. They're automatically believing something without proof. They're automatically believing that the sun doesn't exist without any proof whatsoever, when it is by default illogical to believe something without proof, without evidence. Why would you believe the sun doesn't exist? So let me tell you, if your parents drive somewhere, right, when you're asleep, and you wake up and you don't see your parents anywhere, do you automatically believe that your parents don't exist anymore? Does it make any logical sense to just jump to the conclusion that the reason why you don't see your parents around you is because your parents disappeared and no longer exist in this world? Isn't that an illogical choice by default to make? To just automatically believe that something doesn't exist just because you don't see it in front of you? And that's the problem with atheism. They've already jumped to the conclusion that God doesn't exist just because they don't see God in front of them. And with that mindset, no matter what you do, you'll never be able to change their mind. And that's the problem with atheism. They're already too close-minded to be reasoned with. They've already illogically believed that the sun doesn't exist. So unless the sun comes directly in front of them, nothing you say will ever change their mind. That position isn't, the belief that God doesn't exist isn't something you believe with wisdom. It isn't something you believe with logic. It is an illogical, state. So illogical people, it is hard to reason with an illogical person. Just like someone who believes that the sun doesn't exist. It is illogical, because they've already made an illogical choice to believe that the sun doesn't exist. No matter what you say to them, you'll never be able to change their mind. No matter what you do, you'll never be able to change their mind, because your mind is very illogical. Even if the sun comes back to them, do you know what they'll say? Instead of just admitting that maybe the sun went somewhere else, most people would deny. They say that's a new sun. Instead of admitting that the sun that the sun that just rose from the horizon is the same old sun, they'll instead gaslight you and tell you, nope, that's a brand new sun. The old sun has ceased to exist and this is the brand new sun. Do you know why they'll say that? Because, once you've already told everybody that, the sun doesn't exist, you've spent your entire life telling everybody that the sun doesn't exist without proof, without evidence whatsoever, and you ended up being wrong. Guess what you do? Guess what will happen to you? Everybody will start mocking you for being a fool, for being a liar, for being an idiot who just jumped to conclusion. Because of that, even if there's proof that, the sun exists, reasonable proof, you will still deny it. Why? You don't want to look like a fool in front of others. You don't want to look like an idiot in front of others. Because of this conflict of interest, no matter what proof theists bring to atheists, they will never accept it as proof. Do you know why? Because the position that they're already in is an illogical position. And they know it. Because they know it, it is hard for them to accept the fact that, just to accept the fact that they've been wrong this whole time is very hard for most people. They rather just gaslight you and mock you, insult you for telling them that, they're wrong. Just telling them that they're wrong. You can't just automatically believe that God doesn't exist just because you don't see God in front of you. You can't just automatically believe that the sun doesn't exist just because you don't see the sun in front of you. It makes no logical sense to just jump to conclusion like that. There's no logical, reasoning that could automatically just make you believe that the sun doesn't exist. You can't just wake up at night and not see the sun and automatically believe that the sun doesn't exist. That's not how logic works. That is an illogical choice to make. If you don't have proof that God doesn't exist, you shouldn't believe that God doesn't exist. This is why, and it's impossible to prove that God doesn't exist. So this is why you have to, be careful of atheists, is that because they've already made that illogical choice, nothing you say will ever change their mind. They're trying to guard themselves from being mocked, from being insulted. They're trying to protect their pride. They're trying to protect their ego. They will never admit that any truth, they'll never admit any truth is the truth unless God shows himself in front of them. That's the only thing. And why would God, be manipulated by a fool? Why would God show himself to a fool like an atheist? Why would God go out of its way, God's way? Why would God go out of his way to prove to a small atheist that God exists? Why would God do that? Why would God, go, out of his way to just prove to a fool, an illogical fool who already doubts God right from the very beginning? He didn't even care about truth. He didn't even wait for evidence to show up. He automatically just believed that God doesn't exist out of thin air. There's no proof, no logic involved whatsoever. He just automatically believed that God doesn't exist. Don't you think there's something wrong with that person's mind? So why would God go out of his way to prove to a fool that, he exists? Obviously, God won't waste his time with someone like that. Why would God waste his time with someone who already, denied God, even without evidence, without proof, without any logic whatsoever, involved? Even when countless theologies have proved that God exists in their own little ways, these atheists are just so, narrow-minded and illogical to accept the truth. They do not want the truth because the moment, the truth comes out, they'll look like fools who illogically started believing that God doesn't exist without evidence. And no one wants to look like fools in front of their friends and family members. No one wants their reputation ruined. No one wants to be called a fool. No one wants to be called a retard. No one wants to be called a scammer. No one wants to become a manipulative bully. No one wants to be called a gaslighter. So because of that, it's hard for atheists to ever accept truth, even if, it's right in front of them. This is why I say, like I've said in many episodes before, just ignore atheists. They're not wise enough to know that it's illogical. They're not smart enough to know that it's illogical to automatically believe that God doesn't exist. Because it is illogical to believe something without proof. So, you have to be careful around atheists. Some of these atheists have power, they have influence, they have, so many means, to deal with you. If you're a theologist or a scientist who has proof that God exists, they don't care about proof. Just like the person who believes that the sun doesn't exist, no matter how much, how many proofs you bring to him, he'll just because because it chose that path, it chose that choice illogically. No matter how many logical proofs you bring to him, it won't make any logical sense to him. Because the person already believed that God doesn't exist. The person already believed that the sun doesn't exist. And that's an illogical choice. And since they already made an illogical choice, the person's mind obviously is not really that logical to begin with. A person who's not that logical to begin with, trying to use logic on a very illogical person, is not going to work out well for you. It's not going to work out well for you at all. So using logic, in front of an atheist, it's like playing music in front of a mouse or in front of an ant. They're not going to be paying attention to it, man. They're not going to pay attention to you. They don't care about the truth. They only want to, even if you bring truth and they know it's the truth, they'll try to hide it. They'll try to bury your truth no matter, whichever way they can. They don't want the truth to come out. At some point in time, it'll make them look bad. It'll make them look so bad that, they just can't handle that heartbreak. The heartbreak of being mocked by everyone is not something, most people can handle. And because it's not something most people can handle, telling an atheist the truth, telling someone who believes the sun doesn't exist the truth, is just gonna hurt. It's just gonna hurt them. It's gonna hurt them so badly that they'll try to hide it from the rest of the world. If someone who calls himself, who believes that the sun doesn't exist, then goes out telling everybody in the world that the sun doesn't exist, everybody around them that the sun doesn't exist, and then come to find out the sun exists, what do you think they'll look? How do you think people will treat them? People will treat them very badly for being liars, for being fools. And that's the problem that atheists have right now. They've already, illogically jumped to the conclusion that God doesn't exist. And because of that, if you ever bring proof that God exists in front of them, instead of accepting the proof, they will deny it to the day they die. Because they don't, it makes them look like fools. It makes them look like retards. It makes them look extremely illogical. And they don't want to look extremely illogical in front of others. Especially some of these atheists. Some of these atheists are scientists, they're, renowned scientists. And, these renowned scientists do not want to look like illogical fools in front of others. Because they don't want to look like illogical fools in front of others. What do you think will happen to you if you go to a renowned scientist, if you go to a renowned scientist and give him proof that God exists? Give him proof that'll make him look bad in front of others. You're bringing proof to him that'll make him look like a fool in front of others. Do you really think he'll accept that truth? Do you really think he cares about truth at this point in time? At some point in time, it's better for him to hide the truth than tell the truth. Why? Because the truth will ruin his reputation. It'll make him look illogical and foolish. And no renowned scientists want to look like an illogical fool in front of everyone. Especially when they spend their entire lives saying that God doesn't exist. And this is the problem with atheists. Because they're so illogical, using logic on them no longer works. Their very illogical stance goes against logic. So no matter how logical a theist or a scientist is, it will never be able to change their mind because their minds are too illogical to be reasoned with. So this is what you have to deal with. If you're a theist or a scientist, be careful dealing with atheists because some of these people have power, and if they try to get rid of you, that's something you have to be careful of because this world, they're very dangerous. Sorry, this world, there's very dangerous people in this world. There are very dangerous people in this world. There are very powerful people in this world, and you have to be careful who you're dealing with. Not everyone is kind. Not everyone cares about the truth. Especially atheists. You think they care about the truth, but the truth is, they just like mocking theists. When a theist actually brings the truth to them, they will ignore it and mock you. Why? Because they're too illogical to understand it's the truth. And even if they understand it's the truth, they're too illogical to just accept it. Why? Because it'll make them look bad. Because it'll make them look bad. They'll try to harm you. They'll try to downplay the truth. They'll make you look like a fool. They'll try to, ruin that truth. They'll try to ruin your life. They're trying to make sure everyone thinks like you're a fool. You're the retard. You're the one making things up. Because, they don't want to ruin their own lives, and they've already ruined their lives already, illogically believing that God doesn't exist. Because they've already illogically believed that God doesn't exist. Anytime truth comes, they'll try to bury it. So you go to an atheist to tell them, about God. You're going to someone who would try to, deny everything you say and then try to bury it. You're bringing the information to the wrong group of people. These guys will never listen to you. They'll instead mock and insult you and try to gaslight you. They'll try to manipulate you into thinking what you're saying is a lie. That's all they know how to do. They don't have proof on their side. The proof is not on their side because there's no truth. There's no proof that God doesn't exist. Since there's no proof that God doesn't exist, the atheists do not have truth on their side. They do not have logic on their side. Logic goes against them. Because logic goes against them, they'll try every means possible to trick people into thinking they're the logical ones. They'll try every means possible to try to bury the truth, every truth possible that comes to their doorstep. They'll try to bury it and gaslight you. They'll try to manipulate their audiences into thinking you're the liar. They'll try to trick you into thinking you're the fool. When the truth is, their very stance is illogical. Being an atheist by default is an illogical choice. It's a foolish choice to make. So that's it for today's podcast episode. I hope you can hear me clearly. Cause I think when I speak too fast, the mic doesn't catch it. I'm using my phone's mic, like I said before. So because I'm using the cell phone's mic, it's not as clear, and sometimes I gotta speak slower, and it's hard to speak. It's hard to get the point across if I don't speak, in my usual pace. Because it's easy to forget things when I'm not speaking normally. So because of that, there could be issues where you can't hear what I'm trying to say sometimes. So sorry if you can't hear me completely, And sometimes I move the phone away from my face sometimes, and then closer to it. So there's also that as well. I have headphones on. I have headphones, but they don't work as well. The mic on my headphones do not work as well as the one from on my phone itself. So that's it for today's podcast episode. If you can hear me, clearly, that's good. If you can't, I'm sorry. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.